Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Today's episode is about one of the most popular and unpopular British politicians in history. Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party in 1994 and 3 years later guided Labour to its first election win in 23 years. Considered a great breath of fresh air, he promised to revitalise British society and its economy after a generation of Conservative government. His political project, known as New Labour, is seen as having taken Labour away from the ideology and left-wing dogma that had defined it for most of its existence, and towards a steely form of political pragmatism that prioritised winning power and holding on to it over political radicalism. This was certainly successful in the high-growth 2000s, with Blair winning 3 elections on the trot and chalking up 10 years as Prime Minister. But at some point, the British public's initial love for Blair turned to an intense dislike. Blair saw himself as strategist-in-chief, but at some point the calculation and strategising that made him such a prolific election winner bled into his own personality. It's not a surprise then that when you mention Blair's name today, people think of him as cold, aloof and untruthful. When did things start to go wrong? Was it Labour's failure to really reform Britain's post-Thatcher economy? Was it the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? Was it Blair himself? That is the question at the heart of today's conversation. My guest today is the Labour Member of Parliament for Dagenham and Rainham in North East London, Jon Cruddas. Jon worked for Blair in the late 1990s before becoming an MP in 2001. He later worked for Labour leader Ed Miliband as policy coordinator. I used to class Blair as a political hero of mine, something I would no longer claim, but I was really looking forward to this conversation, and it didn't disappoint. Jon and I discussed Blair's political philosophy, New Labour's timidity in reforming the economy early on in the Blair years, Iraq, and New Labour's record on immigration, something Jon had first-hand experience dealing with in his own constituency. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Tony Blair. Jon, it's great to meet you. How are you?
Yeah, fantastic, actually. It's really good to... I'm looking forward to the conversation with Tony about Tony Blair, actually. It's something that's not really discussed that much, strangely, apart from the usual one-dimensional terms, you know.
Well, let me ask you a simple question to begin with. Well, it's a simple question, not with a simple answer. How would you describe Tony Blair's politics?
How would you describe it? Well, I would say it's usually described on a fairly simple left-right template within the party, especially within an increasingly factionalized party. So you either love him or you hate him. And in one sense, he lives a sort of domestic exile, right? So, and the obvious point about that is Labour can't own its own victories or defeats, actually learn from it, because we're so absolutist in our rejection or are beholden to Blair as a political messiah. Similar to the last days of Thatcher, actually. Those who were there at the death, if you want, contract what the political figure was because they were the last defenders, and they're usually the people that are in the short term actually define who he was, who she was. But same with Blair. The last defenders of New Labour arguably have lost and have truncated the political character of it. I always found him someone who tried to weave together the two basic elements of the Labour tradition, its ethical components and its economic or material elements. And that divide is the real divide within the history of the left, actually, rather than the left and right. And looking at it through that prism, I think, allows you a more nuanced understanding of how Blair changed, how he contracted his own political character for his own personal political purposes. It allows for a more elaborate, complex story about who he was and who the government was and how it changed and how it diminished electorally. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer, but so how do you understand Tony Blair? Not through the usual criteria of how he's understood, I think, is the answer to that, because that doesn't offer that much insight. And actually, arguably, that's getting worse with as we progress. He's become someone who's very easily understood by people, but it was a much more complex political project, and it belittles what happened around the creation of New Labour and its early successes and its huge, potent electoral appeal as well.
So just in very brief terms, you mentioned the dichotomy or the divide between kind of an ethical side of the left and an economic one. For people listening, in simple terms, how would you differentiate between the two?
Well, Tawney, for example, said that the great divide within the history of the left was between those who were concerned with the ethics, questions of human fellowship and well-being, if you want, and those that were concerned with the economics, the ways to ameliorate suffering and inequalities. And that has created two distinct streams, one usually characterized as ethical socialist, and the other usually described as economistic or Fabian. And that really is the essential divide. It's not really a left-right divide in the history of the Labour Party. The great Labour historian Ken Morgan once said that you can understand the history of the Labour Party through the differences between the ILP when it was formed in 1893 and the Fabian Society when it was formed in 1894, and tracking that fault line between the ethical and the economistic traditions allows you a much more sophisticated understanding of the divisions both within the left and the right of the Labour Party, but also the changing character of Labour in opposition and in government. And basically that story is a victory in the 30s led by Hugh Dalton, who nurtured a group of economists, planners, technocrats, if you want, that took over the Labour Party. And it was a middle class takeover away from what's sometimes called the apostles of the old religions, Keir Hardie, Ramsay MacDonald, George Lansbury, and the economists took over, concerned with questions of utility rather than human well-being. And that has been the dominant character of the Labour Party since. And at times that's changed. And I always think the interesting thing about Blair is he knew all that history. He's often seen as someone who was outside of Labour. Actually, he had a very careful understanding of the history of the Labour Party and tried to unite those two traditions. Actually, in his, I think this is right, in this first speech to Parliament, he talked about pulling together the ethical and the rational streams within Labour's history. And so that's how I understand the history of the Labour Party in terms of that division.
I think John Major, the leader of the opposition, stood up and looked around at his own MPs and said, "Can any of you tell me what any of that meant?" Right. You interest me, John, because I don't feel like you fit easily into the ideological boxes within the Labour Party that people constantly talk about. Whereas I think, as you said, Blair's kind of come to define a whole era of Labour politics, really, and it's an era that many people within the party aren't comfortable with now. If we go into his past a bit, he was born in 1953 in Scotland. His father was a barrister. He was educated at quite an expensive public school in Scotland. That obviously set him apart from Labour's traditional base. But I think more important still was the fact that he'd come from a Conservative family. His father was a Tory. You mentioned his political biography a second ago. Do you think that his family history, his Tory past, played on Blair's mind a lot, especially in the early days, in his early career?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. I mean, but within that family, there was the Conservative elements. I think he said quite recently the loss of his mother when he was quite young, when he was at university, had a really quite profound effect on him and turned him towards quite fundamental spiritual concerns. And this was occurred whilst at university under the guidance of philosophers like John McMurray. He excavated some of those ethical traditions alongside some of that Conservative family history, and it created quite a hybrid, if you want, so he stood on the Labour's 83 election manifesto. I think he was a member of CND at one stage, and then he wasn't. And, so he sort of, as was customary at the time, you sort of navigated through some of the factions. But there's no doubt there was a conservative story there. There was a story of loss, I think, in that, which is really quite important in terms of the journey of the person himself. And then there was his philosophical concerns at university, which spread from, I think, some of those personal losses, which bent into a specific understanding of labour history, which he studied, I think. I mean, again, there's this recurring drumbeat within the way he's received, is that he was an outsider. Right, he was a blow into the Labour Party. Well, I never quite saw it like that, actually. I thought he showed quite an agile mind in terms of the history of the party and its intellectual traditions, actually more so than an awful lot of more traditional Labour leaders often, actually, as well. So I think he was. It's a more complex story than the simple caricature of someone who was, even though there was that conservative history, he wasn't born into the working class traditions of the classical sort of genealogy of a party member, representative, leader.
1983 was when he entered Parliament. It was one of the lowest points in Labour's electoral history. And he shared an office in Parliament with probably the most important person in his political career, Gordon Brown. It was an incredibly close relationship, the closest, as I said, of his career, possibly of his life at that stage. He said they were like lovers, they were that close. What did Blair and Brown think had gone wrong with the Labour Party in the 1980s? They'd found themselves in this terrible electoral bind. They had about 200 seats, around the same number of seats that Labour has now. How did Blair and Brown diagnose that?
Well, I think theirs was a fairly orthodox diagnosis, I think, actually, which was that the Labour Party was too associated in the minds of electorates with periods of boom and bust. It was too associated with the overmighty institutions of working class industrial life, the trade union movement, that it was too associated with nuclear unilateral withdrawal, which was at odds with the tempo of the country in terms of the desire for multilateral international solidarity. And there was this overall sense that the Labour Party was at odds with the mainstream of the country, and interlinked with that was an acknowledgement of the profound redrawing of politics and new electoral coalitions forged by Thatcher, and what was then emerging as analysis of Thatcherism, which they were acutely aware of, that emerging debate about historic turning points that they were living through, which is often very difficult to understand as you live through them. But I think they were very quick to recognise the nature of the political and economic rupture that was occurring around them, which the Labour Party appeared ill-equipped to even acknowledge, what was going on in terms of, almost similar to today, actually, the redrawing of class coalitions in periods of profound economic and political change. So they were, and partly through, sharing an office, but almost his political character was incubated in the offices of Gordon Brown, because of he was, it still is a towering figure in the British Labour movement, and someone with, even though he was very young, had an extraordinary tenure as a leader of political parties, both in Scotland and the UK. So he slipstreamed a lot of that, I think, and, he obviously learned immense amounts in that period. Even by the late 80s, when he got into the front bench, I think it was a shadow economic team initially, dealing with some of the questions of bank takeovers and corporate corruption. Later, when I got to know him, because I was an employment policy officer, he became shadow employment minister, I think, in 1990. Had big issues to deal with the closed shop and stuff. But by then, even those 7-8 years in Parliament, he'd moved forward dramatically in terms of people's associating him with someone who was, key to the future viability of the party, and it's not just its existence, but its capacity to win elections, and central to what emerged as the modernising tendency within the party.
For sure. I mean, you mentioned that the idea that Labour had become too close to the trade unions, which were considered far too powerful within much of the country. That narrative persisted, and Labour lost for the fourth time in a row in 1992. Blair and Brown were both in the shadow cabinet by that stage. And in 1994, after the sudden death of Labour's leader, John Smith, it was believed that one of them would stand for Labour leader. And it was Blair that stood for the leadership then. Blair and others round him, like Peter Mandelson, thought that Blair would appeal more to voters in the south of England than Gordon Brown. Were they right?
I think they probably were right on that specific question. But I think there was more than that as well. I mean, he'd also shown some pretty strong leadership characteristics in his job as shadow employment spokesperson when he had to deal with issues like the closed shop and Labour's relations with the unions, which in the policy review, which came out of the defeat in 1987, with 2-year thing led by Neil Kinnock, that was one of the outstanding issues that was never resolved, was the links with the unions, and Blair was specifically in there to try and sort that out, and he did, and that was a pretty stiff challenge, as was reshaping Labour's approach to law and order, which he took on after the 92 election as Labour's Home Affairs spokesman. And the Bolger case was a key one where he talked about what was going on and spoke to the changing character of the country in terms of what we tolerate, we forgive, and being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime became the sort of signature to that, but it spoke to deeper currents within society. So I think it would obviously he spoke to the southern. There had been a series of Fabian pamphlets which talked about Labour's southern discomfort by Giles Radici, and they become emblematic in terms of diagnosing Labour's problems. And I think there was a lot of evidence to suggest that Blair, more than anyone almost, spoke to that southern discomfort. And so I think that was one of the elements which pushed him through in those days after John died. But I would say it was built on pretty firm foundations that he'd established in the years preceding that in terms of being a prospective leader. I mean, I had argued, for example, to him in 1992 that he should have stood for deputy leader, and others did as well. But he didn't put his hand in the... He didn't accept any nominations for that. He thought it was too early. So he was very much in that leadership swim from earlier than then. It wasn't a shock to many, but...
Did you vote for him in 94?
Yeah, I voted for him and John Prescott.
There wasn't another general election until 1997. Labour were ahead in the polls going into the election. The Conservatives had been in power for a very long time. By that stage, they were unpopular. And on May the 2nd of 1997, Labour won in an amazing landslide. They got 418 seats. I checked just before we went on. For reference, Boris Johnson currently has 360. So this was an extraordinary majority. What are your memories of that night, John? Were you surprised at the scale of the majority? And what did you hope Labour would do with that majority?
Well, it was an extraordinary night. Over the festival, I was there. I've been in the head office all day and out to a couple of marginal seats. I got stuck into a lot of beer celebrating because I couldn't vote when Margaret Thatcher had got into power, so that was my youth was taken up with a lot of political battles, and that was the culmination of it was the next day walking up into Downing Street actually, but it was that night was something to celebrate. There was an extraordinary night. There was a sense of, the country looked like it was pivoting away from something towards something, which looked like it was a story of economic and social modernisation. That was the general sort of template. So it was an incredibly upbeat, optimistic mood. No one anticipated the scale of the defeat of the Tories. To give you an example, the very next morning, there was a meeting which had never been discussed, I don't think, of general secretaries in Congress House. And a number of the general secretaries contemplated immediate disaffiliation, because this meant that the Prime Minister was going to be so powerful and he was going to be so disinterested in the trade union movement, and he was going to likely try and force them out of the party, that it was best to leave first. Now, that sort of is an indication of how everyone was blindsided by the scale of the victory, because we were so used to the omnipotent political power of the conservatism in Britain and the potency of Thatcherism and its enduring quality. And and none of us believed the polls, because you couldn't believe the polls, because, we were so battle scarred by and defined by conservatism and Thatcher that we couldn't let ourselves believe that defeating them was possible, really. So it was an extraordinary sort of epic moment, really, in British political history, and everything seemed possible. And we were in power for 13 years, and it seemed to have gone very quickly with hindsight now.
And what were your hopes of what they would do in that term?
Yeah, well, I suppose my view was it was there to be shaped, really. It was up for grabs. I mean, there's an awful lot of post-match analysis in terms of which it's as if everything was defined and everything was cast in granite in those moments within New Labour. It was shaped early. I'll give you an example. It's often referenced a speech Tony Blair made on the campaign trail in '97, where he talked about, if you elect Labour, then we'll still have the least regulated labour markets in Europe. In the Sun, he gave this interview and the campaign trail to try and neutralise the thing that we're in the pockets of the unions and stuff. And that's used, I see it referenced in academic journals now, to signal that was what New Labour was about. But that was not the case, because even then, when he was saying that, we'd been spending years drafting legislation that we enacted around the minimum wages, the regulation of working time, trade union recognition, which, put in place some quite significant changes to labour law. But people believe and read what they want to read with hindsight, and they take out one's little speech on the campaign trail to signify that New Labour was a defined thing at that stage. To me, it was a politics that was there to be shaped, really. And that was the true in Downing Street. I went into Downing Street. I was fortunate enough to go into Downing Street for a few years. And there wasn't one Downing Street. There was 20 of them. There was liberals in there. There was more conservative elements. There was more trade union supportive elements. There were devolutionists. There were centralisers. There were ultra New Labour figures. It was a very fluid political environment, and it remained that throughout the first term. I would argue that New Labour emerged really into what we understand today, especially in the second term, arguably at the expense of what could have been. But throughout the first 3 or 4 years, it was a very much up for grabs what it could be.
Do you think he knew what he wanted to do?
I think Tony Blair, the genius of Tony Blair actually is that I always see him working from a very abstract approach. So if there is a difficult issue, he will take it from an abstract position about where I need to be, and then work out the route map to where he needs to be politically in terms of political positioning, and then chart a path to do that through policy was the way to get to the position he needed to achieve. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, peace of Northern Ireland, he knew where he needed to go. So he ripped out a lot of history, a lot of the animus, and became quite technical in trying to see the sweet spot and then extract sort of policy and negotiation to achieve that. And he did that. It was an exercise in political positioning throughout, by which the policy unit then delivered the route map to the political position he needed to achieve. And I think that's what he saw his role as, which was sort of strategist in chief, really. Now, in the second term, I think he would identify his role as changing quite dramatically and learning on the job much more, becoming much more managerial and technocratic and knowing how to govern. But in the early days, he didn't. And I think that was to his benefit that he acknowledged that his job was the key strategist of the evolution of new labour. With the strategy was a second term, and the strategy was a third term. You know, that was the currency of politics. It wasn't necessarily economic and social transformation. The currency of politics was incumbency, through which you would then re-engineer the economy, modernise society, and the constitution, which is a slightly different, slightly non-ideological, or maybe a more modern way of achieving your political objectives, your traditional political objectives.
One of the things that defines Blair, or that I think about Blair's programme, the kind of central part of it is investment in public services, especially education. There was his famous speech in 1996 where three most important things to me: education, 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 and also investment in the National Health Service. The first term didn't really see a big increase in funding for public services. Gordon Brown actually turned out to be quite a prudent chancellor in the early years. Do you remember feeling disappointed by that?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I was in favour of immediately trying to, rebuild public services, but that was tactically seen as a one for later, through a period of establishing our fiscal bona fides, one of consolidation economically. At the same time, there was an awful lot to do. I mean, there was an awful lot to do in terms of Scottish, Welsh, London devolution, Good Friday agreements, national minimum wage, Human Rights Act, freedom of information. That first term was really awash with all sorts of really strong legislation. So it was an ongoing tension, but the argument willed out about the need to reassure so as to ensure durability of the government. So then you could incrementally rebuild the investment agenda in terms of public services, and that was a sort of judgment call, which now subsequently what happened in the second term, especially the money really did start pouring in. But I mean, with hindsight, maybe I think there was a certain macroeconomic timidity, which I think a lot of the people would say, given the time frame by which you turn around public services through reinvestment, that was probably a strategic mistake. But Labour had been out in power for 18 years. Generations of us went through those years whereby we thought, we wouldn't win again, and so the lesson many people learned was you cannot again sacrifice your economic bona fides once you've spent so long to re-establish them with Bank of England independence. So we cannot have a dash for sort of growth in terms of public service financing. Yeah,
it's understandable, but I guess tomorrow never comes, possibly.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. I mean, I'm trying to sort of present some of the arguments which were quite common at the time, and
sure.
I'm trying to be sort of generous about sort of understanding them. I mean, it was also I should add, a lot of this was it was all pre 2007 2008 crash, and there was a sense that there was a sense that growth was locked in, that we had a sort of compact with finance capital, if you want. Yep. That if we played this right, we could camp out in Middle England. That if we played this right, we could be in power for a very long time. So let's, we don't have to rush to this. We can grind it out and extract this political and economic dividend through this, political sophistication in terms of New Labour, New Britain, Middle England, and finance capital. And there were huge benefits if we keep our shape around that sort of political equation. Now, there were 3 thumping majorities on the back of that model. Yeah. I would argue it came at a price in terms of look, the basic divide for me with New Labour was always be whether we're going to genuinely introduce a form of modern economic stakeholding, if you want, to re-engineer the economy, to rebolt, as I would see it, the working class back into the management of the economy, which we successfully done in the post-war era through the sort of corporate state, if you want. Writers such as Will Hutton, they were arguing for new forms of economic stakeholder, reforming stakeholder models, reforming corporate governance, industrial democracy, trade union rights, alongside reinvestment in public services. And I was very much on that side of things. But that argument got lost, really, in favour of a more light touch regulation, if you want, a more neoliberal North American style capitalism. And that was the central divide, as I thought, saw it, in terms of the management of the economy. And it's safe to say that the latter won out over the former. And that was, I think, one of the, with hindsight, the real argument that was lost in the early days around New Labour, because I still thought it was in play after 1997, not least with people like Ian McCartney working on the minimum wage, and people like John Monks having strong inputs from the TUC, but gradually that faded out, I'm afraid.
Blair was almost like a rock star when he was leader of the opposition, and in his first couple of years as Prime Minister. That was a significant image departure from the Tories. I've seen footage of him presenting David Bowie with a Brit Award in the late 90s, and it all looks kind of, I've got to be honest, a bit nauseating in hindsight, really. What as somebody who wasn't alive then, what did you think of that sort of very showy, trivial type of politics that was beginning to take hold? And do you think, in terms of the quite serious economic dichotomy that you've just been talking about stakeholding versus a more kind of management of globalization approach, do you think that got in the way of having that debate properly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, that sort of gets to the question of whether the victory was too big in 97 and whether the celebrities and the sort of that we were speaking for modern Britain, all the pop stars, Oasis and all of that, we were in power now, and it was more than that. There was almost a cultural power that went with it, and maybe a few more checks and balances, a bit more conditioning, a bit more need to be responsive to some of these long-term economic challenges and voices that had been neglected, and issues of housing, poverty, inequality, flatlining wages. We should have been more agile around that. I think that's a fair response. But on the other hand, it was good to have won. You know what I mean? And to my mind, I quite like the idea of a leader who seemed vaguely, popular, and there was a sense that he was a bit of a rock star. I mean, the thing I always say about Blair, I mean, how do people you describe it? I mean, like, I always think of him as sort of Labour's Miles Davis. The early stuff was the best music ever produced, but the late stuff, just didn't work for me. Do you know what I mean? But when it was good, it was really good, and some of those early times when, I remember the day when the House of Commons sat through the night to introduce the national minimum wage, but the Tories were still claiming it would create 3 million job losses. And, there was a sense of energy and vitality through setting up DFID or, the Human Rights Act, or the time and again, civil partnerships, the list goes on. And we had a leadership team that were flying, and that they seemed, at ease with the modern world and the country, and similarly the country appeared at ease with them, and it was good. Now, I sort of left around 2000 because I got increasingly frustrated around not doing more around some of the issues around work, employment, poverty, housing, inequality, etc. And but and it's easy to be critical, but at the same time, a lot was happening, and we'd won. and it looked like, and we did win again, and we won again, and these were thumping majorities, the likes of Labour had never seen before, and this was sort of totally unprecedented. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, and I take your point. Looking back, I mean, my son, who's 28, very radical, he looks back and he just shakes his head at all of it, you know. But I sort of try and explain that, you know, there was a sort of energy around that on the left. And I would also say, compared to, for example, the situation of Labour today, which is almost trying, as part of a sort of restoration act, to learn from the new Labour period, Labour had a hunger and energy and vitality that was really powerful to behold at the time and be involved with. There was something quite, you know, there was something quite hypnotic about it.
Yeah, and
Especially when,
I think that power and that vitality touched people who hadn't voted for him.
No doubt. I mean, you could say, I mean, the question then is when it changed, you know, because this is a really interesting question. Was it 2001 election where turnout dropped dramatically, and whether we ignored that at our peril, but that was a sort of canary down the mine, if you want. Was it Iraq a few years later? Some argue that it was around a failure to embrace the Commission on the Future of Multicultural Britain, a thing called the Parrott Commission, and instead we turned into a more sort of sour politics of migration and demographic control, and the politics of immigration in 2004 and accession. All of these, you know, what were the turning points? Where did it start going bad? It was a bit of all of that, but the top-up fees debate is another one that I would emphasise in all of this. Yep. But that first term, we shouldn't underemphasise, I don't think, the possibilities attached to it. I mean, I always thought of New Labour a bit like the Conservatives. I thought, well, Thatcher, she sort of consolidated in the first term, but in the second term from 83 to 87, that's where she really started radicalising her agenda. And I always thought, call me naive, right? I always thought the first term for Labour was when we set the footings in the ground, and the second term was when it was radicalised in terms of confronting enduring patterns of poverty, inequality, democratic renewal, constitutional reform, all of that. On the contrary, obviously it did change direction in the second term, but not in the way that I anticipated or hoped, I'm afraid.
Something that happened after the 2001 election, it was probably one of the most important events of Blair's premiership, but it didn't happen in Britain, and it was the fallout from the 9/11 attacks. Blair developed a very close relationship with George W. Bush, the American president. He gave considerable cover to Bush over the Iraq War, and Britain, of course, was part of the invasion of Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein from power. The cover that Blair gave was not cover that was, well, that cover wasn't given by the French, the Germans, or, it's worth pointing out on this day of all days, the Russians. What do you think Blair saw in Bush?
Well, I look at it slightly different to that. I think, going back to our earlier conversation about the methodology of Tony Blair, that level of abstraction where he thought, where do I need to be on any specific subject, and how do I set up a plan to get there? By this stage, I think Tony Blair, it sounds hubristic, but there was a lot of reasons to support this argument that he was a political figure that could possibly blur the edges, land this thing in a place that could take the international community with it. And he was confident in his powers of persuasion and negotiation to build that coalition. So he set out that as his end game. And then he charted a route to do it through 1441 in the UN, through UN resolutions, through the dialogues across Europe. And I think this is where the rubber hit the road, because this was where that, those personal characteristics, that political power that he'd banked for so long and had worked, never not worked. That's when it really did not deliver what I thought he thinks he could deliver. And that's for And I think he did it for the best of reasons. And that's the tragedy of it, actually, because I think he thought he could get to a position that could unite the international community, and born of his own personal ability to deliver it and navigate that path to the sweet spot that I think he anticipated was one that we needed to be at post 9/11. And that failed. It failed dramatically, with huge collateral damage for hundreds of thousands of people. The inability now to have humanitarian forms of intervention because of the fallout from Iraq. The fallout is so dramatic and so profound, it cannot be understated. But I think for a period in 2002-3, he thought, after Kosovo, after Sierra Leone, his relationship with Blair, with Murdoch, with others, that he could be the one that could secure a critical path through this for the international community. And he carried that load and he failed on it. And that's I think the best way of understanding it, in the sense of the mission he thought he could deliver and the end point that he envisaged, and the political skills that held him in good stead to that moment in time.
He gave an absolutely amazing speech in Parliament in favour of the war in 2003. It's one of the best parliamentary speeches I've ever seen. How do you feel about the legacy of the war for Labour, the impact that the war had on your party? I mean, obviously it's done untold damage to Iraq, and that's considerably more important than what it could ever do to Labour. But it has nevertheless done terrible damage to the Labour Party, hasn't it?
Terrible. The intergenerational damage is profound. The international damage is profound. The intercultural damage in terms of different communities. It did sever. I mean, there's no doubt it severed a certain relationship with Blair, with the electorate. I think Michael Howard, even though we won with a majority, I think 66 in 2004, Michael Howard's Conservatives still beat Labour in England, which was quite an interesting figure. I didn't realise that until a couple of weeks ago when someone was explaining this to me. And I think almost the electoral system safeguarded Labour because of the consequences of Iraq. So even though we secured a big majority afterwards, that was one that was delivered by virtue of the electoral system primarily, rather than some sort of recognition by the electorate of the virtue of the Iraq war. On the contrary, I think a lot of polling suggested that broke the link that Blair had with the electorate, and it's more than that. It's not just the death toll. It's more the effects on that notion of humanitarian intervention, which has meant that there's been a diminishment on questions of international solidarity. There's been an isolationism becomes the default anti-position for politicians now because of Iraq, and that's played out in other conflicts through the Syria, Libya, wherever you want to go, and actually 8 years ago in terms of Ukraine, and we'll see how this will play out over the next weeks in terms of the ability to create a durable Western alliance against this form of activity. And a lot of that can be traced back to Iraq, I'm afraid, because of this was a monumental tragedy, an abject failure, I'm afraid, and it can't be seen in any other way, I don't think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Just for people listening, we're recording this on Thursday, the 24th of February, and it appears, well, it's pretty apparent that Vladimir Putin is launching a full-scale assault on Ukraine. I want to talk about something that you in particular, Jon, have criticised about New Labour, and that's immigration. Can you explain what New Labour's record in your mind on immigration was, and why do you have issues with it?
Well, I left the government in 2000. Was fortunate I got elected to be the MP for Dagenham for the 2001 election, and subsequent to that, from 2010, the MP for Dagenham and Rainham in East London. And just by a bit of background, Dagenham is the fastest changing community in Britain because it's got the cheapest housing in Greater London, which has acted as a magnetic pull for migration into and within the City of London. This is in a very working class community, which was decimated through the 1-2 punch of deindustrialization and the right to buy, right? So it meant that the community had to deal with it being the fastest changing community in Britain and one of the poorest. And my problems with the immigration debate was the government never helped us, because we were seen as off the radar of Middle England, which is the key battleground for political power. We were a working class poor community that was disproportionately taking the strain in terms of the management of migration and not getting any help by the state, which was ill-equipped to deal with supporting some of the communities that were taking the strain for patterns of migration that I support. Right. So my concern was that something was building, and you could feel it in Dagenham every day from 2000. Actually, it played out. We became a decade, 5, 6, 7 years later, the front line in a national battle against the far right, the BNP, because we had 12 BNP councillors on our, and it was really ugly, brutal fight. And I was very angry with the government because it was accepting all of the macroeconomic benefits of migration in terms of keeping wages down. It was a sort of modern day incomes policy, if you want, without helping the communities, mostly the poorest communities with cheapest housing, that were growing exponentially and were dealing with some of these very tense relationships. And I was quite angry at the government for not supporting communities like mine. That's basically got to the nub of my frustrations with a migration approach that banked the benefits but wasn't taking responsibility for the consequences of it, really.
And Dagenham, in a way, was the canary in the coal mine on that issue, really, because there's so many other seats and parts of the country that have undergone similar changes since. I mean, having followed your career for a while, I know you're not anti-immigration in and of itself. That's completely. But I mean, I just want to ask you this: you were the head of policy under Ed Miliband, one of Blair's successors as Labour leader. And Miliband did for a while in sort of 2012-13 attempt to make the argument that immigration had happened too quickly in the 2000s. Did you ever worry at all that all Miliband was doing was just sort of unintentionally legitimising right-wing talking points about immigration?
I do, because I think we were playing it the wrong way. Let me give you an example, right? Right when we were fighting the BNP all through the 2000s, I was arguing for an amnesty for unregulated migrants in London, right? Because I could see it as being something that was used by unscrupulous employers to deregulate the labour market at a time when extraordinary abuses were taking place in the private rented sector through the effects of right to buy that passed on, and you were getting this really toxic blend of migration, a specific politics of migration, and forms of exploitation, especially in poor communities, that was fueling right-wing groups were scavenging around this terrain. Right now, you have to deal with this. Now, I would argue you should reset the whole debate, put a floor under it through offering an amnesty. I stood for the deputy leader of the Labour Party in 2007-8, arguing for an amnesty for unregulated migrants because of the way that you need to rethink the whole immigration thing. I also think in order to preserve the social contract and deal with the modern insider-outsider tensions that bedevil the social social democracy, you have to have a way of managing your borders, right? Now that is quite an uncomfortable thing, but if you want to safeguard socialized medicine, socialized welfare systems, socialized housing, then you have to deal with these modern dynamics, especially as the world's heating up and shrinking and people are moving around more. Then it is incumbent on you as a social democrat to navigate your way through it. Now, the right wing approach to this is just to say, raise, walls that you build, controls that you put down. I would argue for reconfiguring the whole debate based around a much more radical approach to citizenship for all people who hear it and access to public services, but also a way of rethinking how we're going to deal with the sheer velocity of change in terms of people's ability to move in and out of countries. Because unless we've done that, then other people are going to move in and literally own this territory, and they're going to be less benign in terms of their approaches, and it's going to be fueling a populist right-wing backlash of the likes that we saw in Dagenham. So your point about us being the canary is exactly right. Now, my argument was, you don't just sort of put "I'm against immigrants" on your mug, right? You have a much more radical economic and social policy, of which part of it is having an honest discussion about how you deal with the velocity of change in terms of people moving in and out of countries. I would argue we failed to do this. We failed to do this in the middle 2000s with New Labour, despite the fact that we're using the benefits of it in terms of fueling this growth that we thought would never end. The warning signs were all there in communities like Dagenham before the music stopped when the economic crash kicked in. We could have got ahead of this and built a different approach to housing, labour markets, the regularisation of unregularised migrants who were feeding a lot of these abusive gang culture in terms of construction, housing, entertainment and the like. And it was incumbent on social democrats to take the lead, or else we'll vacate this territory, and the national conversation would become more sour, shrill, reactionary and populist, and that's exactly what's happened.
Just to get back to Blair, to bring the interview to a close, John, Blair left office in 2007. He never lost a general election as Labour leader. He resigned. He was very unpopular when he left office, and some polling actually suggests he's even less popular now. He is loathed by many people in Britain today, and I think he comes across as a very strange, detached person when you see him in interviews now. Labour haven't won a general election since he left. When you look back at the three things that we've discussed today, the failure to kind of fundamentally change the economic settlement within Britain, Iraq, and immigration, which of those do you think has hurt Blair most? And which of them do you think's hurt Labour most?
Cool. That's a hell of a question, Tom. Very interesting question. Because the first is because it is such a complex story that is still unexcavated. It's not discussed, the complexity of this story. It's quite useful to get into some of the complexity, but there's no easy answers because it's complex. Because Blair, on leaving office, obviously, it's a very mixed story. Some of the money-making Kazakhstan adventures, for example, rest uncomfortably, whereas I think he's done a very good job in terms of some of the work of his institute, and I thought he had quite a pretty good sort of lockdown in terms of his desire to get some debates running around some of the vaccines. And I do, and I know he takes his job very seriously, and he is a believer in public office, etc. So it's a pretty mixed picture. Of those three issues, I think in terms, as you say, as we're sitting here with the tanks going into the Ukraine, I fear that the enduring legacy is one of the collateral effects of the war in Iraq in the capacity for international solidarity to confront tyranny and authoritarianism is probably the biggest effect in terms of humanity. In terms of Labour politics, I think the real effect is the loss of the debate around modern stakeholding early in the first term, and the capacity or the possibilities of reconfiguring the economy, making it more resilient, more inclusive. And I think that could have locked in a working class which subsequently deserted us, and that was played out in Brexit, in the red wall defeats, in having a right-wing populist conservative leadership. All of that, the reasons for all of that lie deep in the decisions within Labour's first term and the paths not taken, I'm afraid. So in terms of the wider consequences, I think you have to look to Iraq. In terms of what I think the purpose of Labour is, the failures around the economy are front and centre with me.
I was watching an interview with you, a speech of yours last night, and you talked about how every time Labour comes to power, 45, 64, 97, they come in with a sense of national renewal, that they're kind of speaking to something deep within the country. I've got to be honest, I don't have anything against Keir Starmer particularly. I think he seems like a likeable person, but I don't see that national renewal story at the moment. Do you?
There was a really interesting piece in The Guardian the other week that said what's going to happen within Labour now and the Conservatives after Boris Johnson are restoration projects back to the new Labour period and the Thatcher period. Almost the sort of default comfort zones, right? Well, I would say if that's what the Labour leadership strategy is today, some sort of new Labour restoration project. New Labour in those mid-90s was a very different it was a political project. It had a rigorous organisational project. It had an ideological project in terms of intellectual renewal. It had a political project in terms of policy development. Now, maybe these are early days, but I see no equivalent at all. And it was highly contemporary, in terms of trying to navigate the key domestic challenges, cultural challenges, technological challenges, environmental challenges, whatever. And it was a highly agile, sophisticated political project which had learnt from a lot of the debates in the Communist Party in the 80s and 90s in creating coalitions. It understood and diagnosed Thatcherism and what it was happening amongst different coalitions in the electorate. Culturally, it was very sophisticated in terms of what it learnt from key intellectuals that had a real powerful influence. It was sort of porous with intellectuals and think tanks and different centres of cultural, intellectual significance. I don't really detect that sort of operation today. Now, it might well be building. I hope to think it was, because my fear is this nation basically votes Tory, except occasionally when usually through decay, incumbency, corruption, it creates an opportunity for an agile, hungry, energetic, contemporary opposition to seize power. Those moments don't come around often, and you really have to grab them if they're around. Maybe this is just an old man talking, but it doesn't feel like an equivalent period to the mid-90s, but it could become one. It could become one over the next couple of years. And maybe Keir Starmer sees his initial task as desk clearing, and now he's going to dramatically change gears. I really hope he does, because, when you see what's going to happen in terms of the cost of living, when you see what happens constituency around the housing crises, welfare crisis, we look at the environmental calamities are all around us. It demands a radical social democracy for the future, and it's sort of incumbent on all of us to try and step up and create that. And that's not a question of leadership. I don't think it's going to be created from a leader's office. It has to be forged outside of it, and it has to condition a leadership rather than be beholden to one. And, we've all been, I think, we're all on a sort of a path there, because that looks a ways away to me. But the clock's ticking because of the environmental challenges and the international and the rise of authoritarian populism. That is the real challenge to me, which plays into what's happening in Ukraine. The jury's out, really. I think that's the best I could say.
Jon, that was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. That was a very interesting sort of rewind into recent political history. It was very interesting to go back there, actually.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. Cheers. Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.